So we are so happy to have you here for today's session, Food Systems in Crisis, Lessons Learned from COVID-19 and Tools to Build Resilience. Brought to you by the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, the Johns Hopkins Center for Applied Public Research, and the Praxis Project. And we'll tell you more about the organizers in a minute. So next slide. We want to start by thanking you for showing up in this space to discuss the power of food. We also want to say thank you to the community partners who have contributed their wisdom, their knowledge, and experience to this discussion, and of course you for participating today. We want to make sure that we acknowledge the challenges and complexities of today's reality, especially COVID-19, which is raging in many parts of the United States and the world and continues to disrupt lives and day-to-day activities. And obviously kind of disrupted this meeting. So we know you're excited to maybe attend this forum in person, and you may be disappointed about the shift to virtual, but we've worked hard to make sure that this session is engaging and interactive, and the rest of the forum as well. And so we know it doesn't quite compare to being in person, but we really want to thank you for showing up, and we're excited to make it as interactive as possible. So next slide, please. We want to start by making sure that we start with the native land acknowledgement. So I'm going to pass it to Jenna, one of today's organizers, to share for the Praxis team.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Jenna. We'll get into introductions shortly, but we did want to spend some time offering a land acknowledgement. And for us, the land acknowledgement is not just about recognizing the history of the lands that we're on, but also the present and the groups that are organizing for change on the Indigenous lands. And so for the Praxis team, we happen to both currently be sitting in Oakland, California, on the traditional home of the Ohlone people. The Ohlone community is still with us today and fighting for the preservation of sacred lands throughout the Bay Area. And so we're going to share some chats and the link for some active groups in the Bay Area, including Indian People Organizing for Change and Sogo Reyate Land Trust, and really invite others as you share and reflect on the native lands you're on to actually, invest resources, energy, and support to those communities that are actively organizing.
Thanks, Jenna. I want to share that the Johns Hopkins University team is joining today from the Baltimore region, the traditional home of the Piscataway and Susquehannock people. So we encourage you to look up where you reside on the native land map and learn more. And you can find a lot more information in the links that are being shared in the chat now. So next slide, please. Here's a nice picture of Kansas City. So we want to imagine that we're all there right now. So let's get started by doing some introductions and getting to know each other. If you could edit your name in Zoom to include your name, pronouns, and location if you'd like. You can edit your name by selecting the three dots in the top right corner and selecting rename. Then you can type in what you'd like there. We're suggesting name, pronouns, and location. And then to get started, I've seen a lot of you doing this in the chat already, which is great, but we want to get started practicing using the chat and getting into, that mindset. So if you could post your location, the native land you're on, if you are aware of it, if not, check out those links later, and your hope for today, that would be great. So please post that in the chat now to test it out and read what others are saying. While you're doing that, I'm going to ask the organizers of today's session to quickly introduce themselves. So I will start. If you go to the next slide, thank you. I am Meg Burke. I'm with this Johns Hopkins Center for Applied Public Research. I'm the Community of Practice Manager, and I'll be facilitating today's discussion. And in my role as the Community of Practice Manager, we focus on connecting research and practice and working with local governments to do so. So let's see, Jenna, can I pass it back to you to introduce yourself quickly?
Yes, absolutely. So my name is Jenna Gaarde and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm a program director with the Praxis Project. And we have done some deep diving into the concepts of disaster justice, resilience, and autonomy, which we'll be sharing about later. And I will pass it to my teammate, Catherine, who's with me here today from Praxis.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Catherine Labiran. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a program manager for research and training at the Praxis Project with Jenna. I will pass it to Elsie.
Thank you, Catherine. Hello, everyone. My name is Elsie Moore. I use she, her pronouns. I am a PhD student at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and I have been working with the Johns Hopkins team. Really excited to meet you all, and I will pass it to Erin.
Hi, everyone. My name is Erin Biehl, and I'm a program officer at the Center for a Livable Future here at Johns Hopkins. And I work with all of the fantastic people on this team to help coordinate this workshop, as well as help coordinate the food system resilience community of practice that we'll be talking about later. And I guess back to Meg.
Yes, I'll take it back.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. If we can go to the next slide. We want to spend a couple of minutes going over the community agreements for today's session in the forum. So you'll see the list on your screen now. I'm going to quickly run through them just so that we all have them clear. But our community agreements for today: listen to understand, not always respond, embrace radical hospitality, build power on the margins, speak from your own experience without invalidating others, be conscious of intent versus impact, listen and try on new ideas, take space and make space. No one knows everything, but together we know a lot. Avoid jargon and acronyms. We acknowledge that we can't be articulate all the time. Be vulnerable and embrace collaborative thinking. So I want to just take a second. If you've got any others that you think are really important and you'd like to add to the discussion, you can post those in the chat. But we want to just note that we've built in a lot of time for discussion during today's session, and we really look forward to having you engaged for the duration of the workshop. So a couple of just logistical notes. During this session, please engage primarily through the chat function during our full group discussions like this one. You can post questions, comments, and ideas there. If you have a comment or a question that you'd like to voice, please use the raise your hand option to get our attention. You can find that by clicking in the reactions section in the bottom right. It's kind of the smiley face emoji. You can find ways to react to comments there and the raise your hand button. So use that if you'd like to speak. Please use video if you are able, and join from a computer instead of a phone to get the most out of our breakout sessions and the technology we'll be using there, like Jamboard. If you have any technical questions or are confused about something, you can post them in the chat, or you can look for the people who are noted as tech support in the list of participants. They can help you. You can direct message them through chat. They're raising their hands so you can see, and you can send messages directly to them instead of to everyone, which will get you more targeted help. And our tech support, if there are additional instructions, could you post those in the chat? I'm going to keep going, but if there's other things to note, please share that with everyone. So if you could go to the next slide. This is obviously a map of the United States and with notes on who is attending today. So we've got a lot of people from across the country, which is great. And a lot of East Coast and Midwest, which is exciting. Several people from Louisiana, especially, which we've already seen in the chat box, which is cool. Someone from Alaska, which is great. Sorry, I know it's really early there. Thank you for joining. Have some more coffee. But this is kind of an overview of who's joining. It's great to see you all here. And if you could go to the next slide. This is the breakdown. I thought this was interesting. This is the breakdown of who's here by organization type. So we've got about a third of the group that are nonprofits and a third that are university or extension, some state and local governments, food policy councils, and people are associated with farms. So a really exciting and diverse group of people. We're so happy to have you all here and have all of these different perspectives shared in the discussion. It's going to make it really exciting. So I'm going to pass it to you, Erin, to talk a little bit about the objectives of today's session and go over the agenda.
Thanks, Meg, and hello, everyone. So the topic of today's workshop is food systems in crisis, lessons learned from COVID and tools to build resilience. So we chose to do this workshop because of the growing interest from food policy councils and local government and community organizations about this topic of food system resilience, particularly with COVID-19. In the last year and a half, it really put this concept on the map for a lot of people working in food systems and outside of food systems. But there's still a lot of ambiguity over what resilience is. There are a lot of different definitions of it. There are a lot of different ways that it's being applied in communities, in governments, in broader systems. And so we really wanted to bring to this session not only an opportunity to for you all to share about your own experiences dealing with the pandemic and food security in your communities, but also to share with you some concepts related to food system resilience that we think can help you think through what this could mean in your own community. So the objectives for this workshop are to discuss the meaning of disaster justice, resilience, and autonomy in the context of food systems and apply it to our own work. To learn about different processes and tools that could be used to inform your approaches to building resilience in your food systems. Like I said, to learn from one another about our experiences during COVID-19 and get some new ideas about how to apply those experiences to the future. And then we're going to end the workshop helping you identify some specific actions that we can take to advance equity and justice in the food system that also build food system resilience through a number of different ways. Slide, please. All right, and so the agenda, this agenda is actually also available in the PDF document that I emailed to all of you last night. If you didn't see that email or are having a hard time accessing the PDF, just let one of us know in the chat and we'll get that to you ASAP. But this morning / afternoon, depending on where you are, after this welcome, we'll kind of dive right into talking about these different concepts that we're going to present and how it relates to your work. Then we'll have a quick break and then talk more about some specific tools to build resilience and equity in food systems. We'll have a presentation from the Praxis project about what they're doing with disaster resilience. And then we'll have Elsie from our team here talk about our food system resilience community of practice work. Then we'll have another break because this is a long day. And we'll end in the last hour by really getting into some really more interactive discussions and talking about lessons learned from COVID and what to do next. I will say there are different opportunities throughout this to for you to engage with us in the chat as well as in some breakout groups, even if it's not specifically listed on the agenda here. So we'll have some variety throughout the day. All right, and I will turn it back to Meg.
Thanks, Erin. So we are really excited to dig into today's content, and I see a question in the chat that directly relates to what we're going to talk about next. So I am going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Jenna, to get us started with talking about concepts and framing with disaster and disaster justice.
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. And thanks for that question. Hopefully we will collectively get that answered together. And so just to kind of set the stage for what Catherine and I are going to share with you, I wanted to talk just briefly about the Praxis project. We are a national nonprofit organization, so we're located all over the United States, and we work specifically with community organizers that are base building, so they really follow the priorities, needs, emerging issues of the communities that they're grounded in to advocate for change, usually around social justice, racial justice issues in their community. As a convener and as an intermediary, Praxis brings those community organizers together to build capacity, to hear about their priorities, and to also advocate for change among public health, philanthropy, and academia. And so everything that we're going to be sharing today is grounded in the reality, lived experience, and work of community organizers that are navigating disaster in their own spaces. And so we have a few reflection questions that we wanted to hear from you all as we open it up.
Thank you, Jenna. So we would love to just begin with asking you this question to think about if you and your community have been affected by a disaster in the past 2 years, how have you been affected? And you can share your response in the chat box. So this could be COVID-19 or another disaster, anything that you define as a disaster, how have you been affected by it? And you can just take a moment to reflect on that and then type it into the chat box so that we can all read it. Thank you for sharing, Rosie. I see pandemic and flooding. I'm seeing another response from Nell, COVID-19, hurricanes and flooding. Elisa mentioned the tornado and how her office was affected. So sorry to hear that. Susan is mentioning COVID-19 and job losses, food system disruption, flooding, tornadoes, climate variations. I'm seeing Elisa reflect on Hurricane Maria exactly 4 years ago. I'm seeing Amanda reflect on the evacuation from the wildfire, COVID-19 again mentioned by Hester, COVID-19 again mentioned by Courtney, and the loss of trees and impact from agricultural land loss. Wildfires, pandemic. Catherine is mentioning working with Guatemalan immigrants and COVID, how that's caused a large food insecurity in that community due to unemployment from COVID with no safety net for immigrants. That definitely resonates with me. So as we're going, please just continue to acknowledge people's responses and the gravity of all that people in this group have experienced, because it's been a lot. And I think sometimes it's easy to just reflect on the disasters that we've experienced while also, forgetting just how many things that people are experiencing on a daily basis and what the last 2 years have been for us collectively. I think we can move to the next slide. Perfect, thank you. So after you finished sitting with your own experiences, we're hoping that you can also answer, how do you define disasters? So what are disasters? How do disasters happen? Persistent social disasters, and how can we assess them? What's the definition of disaster that you personally hold? I see Claudia mentioning it's a disruptive force that is outside of your control. Matt is mentioning large disruptions in normal everyday life for many people, whether that be natural or man-made. I see Susan sharing a reflection and going in a different direction about how community has risen to the challenges and exhibited marvelous care for each other and amazing persistence and resilience, embracing new ways of solving problems. And I'm excited that you share that, because that's definitely something that we will be discussing later on. Just scrolling through, I'm acknowledging all that's been shared, but I'm just going to choose another response. Catherine mentioning a profound disruption in social, economic, and other systems, resulting in various types of essential insecurity, housing, food, security, transportation, etc. Thank you all for your contributions. I think these all intersect beautifully with the definitions that we are about to go on to. So we can go to the next slide. So the concept of disaster, according to the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, refers to a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society at any scale due to hazardous events interacting with conditions of exposure, vulnerability, and capacity, leading to one or more of the following: human, material, economic, and environmental losses and impacts. Traditionally, public attention has focused on the impacts of so-called natural disasters triggered by catastrophic events like hurricanes, earthquakes, fires, and storms. And now I'll pass back to my colleague Jenna, who will share a little bit about Praxis's learning circles and how we, alongside our community partners, have come to define disaster justice.
Thank you, Catherine. So just to give a little context for the space in which our definitions and some of the concepts we're sharing today were collectively developed. The Praxis project, as I shared earlier, convenes community organizers to bring folks together, to connect on shared social issues, and also to build capacity and develop wisdom and knowledge together. And so in the space of, this convening, we brought community organizers together in a learning circle throughout 2020 virtually because of the nature of so many disasters that organizers were facing. And the purpose of this was to recognize the persistent and the urgent disasters that communities are facing, bringing folks together to unpack concepts of disaster justice and provide support with disaster preparedness and response, really coming from a social justice perspective, which I'm seeing touched on really intentionally in the chat. This process, which I'll share a little bit about in the next slide, was co-facilitated with Living Hope Wheelchair Association. They're based in Houston, Texas, and they provide support to individuals who are in wheelchairs, many of whom are immigrants and face significant physical challenges when experiencing disaster, as well as the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. And of course, the lived experience and wisdom from all of the community organizers in this space. Next slide. And so we brought together 47 base building organizations in this process from all across the nation, urban and rural spaces, and we had 6 monthly Zoom sessions, each of which were 3 hours long. And in our time together, we really unpacked a conceptual framework of what disaster means, what disaster justice means, how it intersects with all of the justice issues that folks are organizing for, really connecting to concrete experiences of what disaster means, and then also developed and applied tools together that we'll be sharing with you all today. Next slide. Collectively, we discussed the key disasters that organizers are navigating, and I think that all of these that came up, or most of them, actually came up in the chat already. So you'll see that these are not just natural disasters, but also social injustices and policies that are passed that are causing extreme crises, specifically with communities of color, with immigrant communities, with folks who are marginalized or oppressed in the United States. And then we also talked about the emotional aspect of disaster, that this is not just an intellectual exercise, but really grounding ourselves in the feelings that are evoked when thinking about disasters, such as fear, inequity, colonization, but also solidarity and the power that comes from communities coming together. Next slide. And so some of the themes that came up that, again, I'm seeing reflected in the chat is disasters often human-made and can be perpetuated by policies, by systems that are in place. Disasters can be subjective. Of course, they can be objective. I think we all recognize COVID-19 as a disaster, the physical disasters being exacerbated by climate change, but other humanitarian crises might be experienced differently by different communities. Reliance on community resources and the beauty of communities coming together in the face of disasters, and recognizing that privileges impact people differently in experiencing disaster, and being able to name that when talking about disaster response and disaster preparedness. Next slide. And so throughout this process together, we collectively established our own understanding of disaster justice, which I saw in the chat was also coined by an academic in 2012. I will put the original link to the individual who came up with this terminology. But disaster justice blends the ongoing struggles for environmental, climate, ecological, language, social justice with demands for the improvement of disaster preparedness and response mechanisms. And it's really centered on acknowledging the expertise arising from the experiences of directly affected communities, with an emphasis on transforming the institutions and policies that cause marginalization and inequity. Essentially, as Kisa says in the chat, recognizing that systems are created and maintained by people, and so needing to make changes to those systems and to those people who create and perpetuate them. And so really holding space for social and political issues as disasters, such as state-sponsored violence, harmful immigration policies, racialized incarceration rates, discrimination and marginalization that leads to housing and economic security, and then obviously food insecurity, which is why so many of us are here today. These are all ongoing disasters that underlie a community's ability to recover from a disaster event. Next slide. And so collectively, we developed a disaster justice framework that encompassed various nuanced concepts, including the following. We really held space for the different levels that individuals, communities, society, family experience disaster, moving away from maybe just an organization, but really holding for the personal level as well. We collectively defined disaster and recognized policies as being disaster causing, in addition to being disaster responses. I think for folks even following along in the racialized services delivered by FEMA, really overlooking Black communities in the space of disaster is a really powerful example. We talked about reframing resilience to look at autonomy, solidarity, and mutual aid, which we're going to dive deeper into momentarily. And then we ended on reflecting on a tool that we'll be sharing with you all today called the Continuity of Operations Plan as one of many tools that can advance transformation, not just continuing services, but also thinking about how we can transform society. Next slide. And so before we transition to further grounding in a lot of these really nuanced topics, we want to just hear from folks. How does this framework resonate with you? Elsie put in the chat the definition that we shared. We also will continue to reflect on this together, but would really love to hear how this is landing with folks. See from Kisa. And I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. I appreciate this framework identifying policies as a form of disaster. Matt, this framework is consistent with environmental models of behavior change in health and fields, like public health and health promotion. And I would say definitely zooming out of individual level behavior change, but thinking about social, organizational, political changes that need to occur. Mary reflecting like that it captures acute, chronic, and the systems analysis. So please keep thinking about what is resonating with you, what maybe isn't resonating with you. And in a little while, we're going to actually get into breakouts and continue to reflect on what does or doesn't land. And so I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Catherine.
Right, so in this section, we are going to be discussing and envisioning what resilience means in a variety of ways. We'll look at what resilience means at the personal level, at the communal level, at the organizational level, and also at the systemic level. So we can move to the next slide. So we're looking at this nested diagram. It allows us to piece together what resilience is in those 4 ways that I just named. It also allows us to look at how resilience can occur simultaneously in a variety of levels, and therefore it helps us expand how we define and view resilience. And we'll now expand on each layer individually. Right, so the personal level, when you think of how you assign resilience to an individual, perhaps these are some of the things that come up. So when we think about practicing love, maybe that to you could be a sign of resilience, or just the strength or adaptability, or the idea that resilience is something that is self-described, something that you can assign to yourself. For some people, personal resilience is instinctual. It's just something that you move with naturally, perhaps due to past experiences. Resilience is also sometimes looked at in collaboration or in conjunction with being tough or being able to quickly recover. For some people, resilience is looked at as a permanent thing, as something that always has to exist. For others, resilience looks like self-liberation. And for others, resilience is faith. It's something that allows them to continuously move through life and to ground themselves in that way. And it's important to note that the word resilience can be used interchangeably with resiliency. And we can move to the next slide. On the familial level, for some communities, resilience is viewed as the norm. It's just all that they have known and all that they have practiced. Others view resilience on the familial level as the accountability to decolonize. Others view it as the fragility of our elders and the strengthening of our youth, looking at that intergenerational piece and how the youth can rise and mobilize to protect and look after their families. For others, resilience is the preserving of oral traditions. For me, this is really important, especially as a Yoruba woman, and thinking about how so much of our history and our culture in Nigeria is linked to oral traditions. For others, resiliency means coming together despite interpersonal conflicts. Like in the moments where there is a disaster, how do we unify? And I know that someone in the chat earlier mentioned just how community organizes and mutual aid and things like that. And then we're also looking at familial resiliency as having resources, the ability to act. And others see resiliency in the familial level as the strengthening support of networks. And we can move to the next slide. And now we're at the organizational level. So resilience could be returning to core values, the core values that the organization named in its inception, really centering and grounding in those values. It could also be supporting and being supported by community, the ability of the organization to understand that it's functioning in this ecosystem of people that want it to do well and to be sustainable. Resiliency could also look like serving our own needs through that organization. Or perhaps it could mean adapting during COVID. You know, I think many of us who are part of organizations have seen just how much of an impact the pandemic has had on our organization. So organizations that have been able to sustain themselves, perhaps they view themselves as resilient. Again, linked to that is being prepared. And another factor could be the shared understanding of values and social justice. That could be a sign of resilience as well. Then we can move to the next. And now we are on the community level. Things like generosity could be seen as resilience. The shared survival of systemic oppression and how that allows people to bond and relate to each other. Again, as I mentioned, mutual aid, these networks that allow people to exchange resources and allow needs to be met can be seen as a sign of resilience. For others, resilience is solidarity and recognition between communities. What does it mean to be seen in that way? And how does being seen allow you to be heard and recognized? For others, resilience can be the ability to adapt, to be malleable, to change in times of disaster. For others, resilience is simply beauty. What does beauty allow for our communities and what possibilities does it create? For others, resilience can be denouncing insidious ideas from local elected officials. Resistance could be resilience in that sense. And others, it could be returning to growing food, sustaining ourselves. How does that link to resilience? Another example is keeping hope alive, and just optimism, how impactful optimism is, especially in times like this. Another example is valuing knowledge in communities and communal healing. And now I will pass it to Erin, who will talk about resilience on a systems level.
Could you go to the next slide, or were you going to do? Yeah, there we go. Okay. Before we dive more into this, we just wanted to share what we see this all looking like at a systems level, because we're talking about food system resilience. And so it's a little bit different approach from what you've just heard from Catherine. And so next slide, please. Coming from a more academic approach, we think of system resilience as the capacity of a system, be it an individual, a forest, a city, or an economy, to deal with change and continue to develop. That's a very kind of broad definition of resilience. And for us, from kind of what we've been reading about and hearing about working with local governments, it's thinking about how to learn, adapt, transform a community or a system if needed, and persist despite any kind of challenge. And it's not just preparing the system for some sort of disruption. It's more you're assuming something will happen that will cause some sort of disruption. You can't always predict everything. So what are our capacities for overcoming different challenges? And then just to be clear, sometimes resilience at this, thinking about food systems is talked about in terms of like interchangeably with sustainability, but it isn't sustainability. Sustainability as well as stability are really talking about the ability to continue as you are into the future. And so if you hear about a supply chain, for example, often they're talking about supply chain resilience in terms of trying to make sure that the supply chain is stable. And so just returns back to normal as quickly as possible. But as we've heard from the individual to the societal and systems level, just being stable isn't necessarily enough or what we want always. And returning to a status quo in a system that already does not serve many people well isn't necessarily what we're trying to be supporting here. So I'll turn it back to Catherine here for the next section, but just wanted to kind of throw in that very broad systems understanding from our point of view about resilience.
Thank you for sharing that, Erin. So I'm just going to quickly go over the kind of difference between autonomy versus resilience before we move to look specifically at food system resilience. We want to pause and share this additional framing. So the group discussed rethinking resiliency as it's unjust for impacted communities to need to be resilient in the first place. And we just want to think about these questions of what would it look like for us to remove the environmental and societal factors that require some communities to perpetually be resistant against harms caused by other communities, rather than continuously look to communities that have been historically and presently impacted by disasters to need to be resilient in order to survive. What if collectively we work towards the autonomy of our communities? So autonomy means challenging the requirements of administrative agencies during a disaster response. It also means rethinking and affirming the worth of human lives beyond ideals of productivity. And for me, this really resonates because it creates space for communities that are directly impacted to rest, to think about things like pleasure and joy, rather than just being in survival mode and having to feel like they must be resilient all the time. It's also the capacity of communities to resist externally imposed narratives about their own circumstances, to be able to determine and to create the narratives themselves. It also means protecting local experiences and knowledge in opposition to oppressive and colonizing models of creating, validating, and circulating knowledge. A shift in autonomy, or a shift to autonomy, I should say, means imagining and building the future of communities and their needs and well-being without external pressures of the state, capitalism, and colonialism at large. Autonomy in this context means challenging the requirements of administrative agencies, as was mentioned, and all of these things that we see listed on this slide. Although a full shift to autonomy is unattainable within our lifetime due to our current political realities, adopting an autonomous perspective can be a powerful tool to reimagine and create a society that has the ability to respond better to the needs and dreams of historically disadvantaged communities. And now I will pass it over to Erin.
Thanks, Catherine. So we're going to shift a little bit, and I know we're throwing a lot of terms and ideas at you right now, but pretty soon we're going to allow you to participate a little bit more and process all of this information that we're sharing with you. So like I said earlier, the perspective that we're coming from at the Center for Livable Future is an academic perspective, and from an organization sitting within a school of public health, and also what we've learned working with local governments on this issue of food system resilience. So a lot of what we've heard from Praxis, for example, is, for me at least, thinking about how what resilience could look like, or what kind of resilience is even needed from the ground up. And I kind of think of how we're approaching this as how do we address food system resilience more from a top-down approach. And so we're hoping in this workshop that we'll be able to meet somewhere in the middle. And we recognize that there may be tension between these different terms. And so we want you to talk about that and process that. So how we think about food system resilience is this definition is one of many definitions, but we think of it as the capacity over time of a food system and its units at multiple different levels to provide sufficient, appropriate, and accessible food to all in the face of various and even unforeseen disturbances. And a way that we try to think about this and try to address some of the issues of avoiding just this mindset of going back to the status quo is to, when we think about food system resilience, think about resilience of what? What is this system or community or organization critical to a food system that we're trying to protect and ensure that they can withstand any challenges that may come? And then what are we being resilient to? You can build the capacity to be resilient to an event without that event happening, but often we think of it in terms of resilience to a potential disaster or to a long-term stress on households or the economy. And we think it's also important to think about what all of this is for. So if you are a food policy council that is really working towards building healthy food access in your community as a critical goal of your work, you might want to think about this in terms of how does this resilience work also build that broader goal or that key goal that we're trying to achieve in our community. And then who is being affected by this work? Is it just maintaining a status quo for some supply chain businesses, or is it really helping build resilience across the system and within different communities? Next slide, please. So this is a very common image that you've seen or may see when you hear about resilience in systems. And basically the idea is that the system is working at some level at any point in time, and depending on how you're defining what your system is and what your goals are. And then if you have a stress over a long term or a shock like a hurricane, it impacts the system and some things stop working. And so resilience is really about your capacity to absorb that shock and not have too much impact, or your ability to make some adjustments and have the ability to adapt. Or if the system is really not meeting the goals that you want it to be meeting, there can also be opportunity for transformation in the food system because of these different events that lead to a new normal that hopefully is better than what you started with. Next slide, please. So there are different ways that you might define your food system and what you're working for. One thing that we've focused on is looking at food security as at a minimum, an outcome of a food system, and trying to understand how different crises could affect different aspects of food security, and trying to understand how availability, access to food, as well as acceptability and cultural preferences for food, and understanding if appropriate food is available at all times. So this is just one way to kind of look at an outcome of a food system. Next slide, please. And there are a lot of terms, again, related to food, to resilience. But I think what, for me, it comes down to, if you're thinking about building a more resilient system, is to think about reducing risk. So thinking about those crises that might affect your community and your system, and reducing the vulnerability. But then what are those assets, whether it's people or natural assets or other systems that are you want to enhance in a crisis or before a crisis, that can build different attributes of your system that can support resilience. Next slide, please. So I'm going to try and put some of these concepts to work. So I invite you to think about the example of a food bank in a community. So for an example of looking at whether or not a food bank could absorb a disruption, you could ask how much food does it have on hand at any point in time? Because if the food bank has some sort of backup, it could absorb, a power outage, for example, and still be able to serve food to its service community with minimal disruption. So it's robust, but it doesn't have to adapt much. An adaptive capacity in a food bank would be, can they adjust their hours of service? Can they adjust their delivery methods? If there's something that's making it difficult to kind of follow their normal routines. So it's making those adjustments that really adapt what they're doing. And then to be transformative, an example of that could be is if a food bank is asking, not only can we serve our community in the short term to address food security, but what can we do to eliminate the need for a food bank altogether? How do we transform the system so that we don't have to think about these very short-term crises because people aren't food insecure to begin with? Next slide, please. And then just going down to some other examples of what different aspects of more resilient systems could look like. I'm sure you may hear about diversity or redundancy, and the idea behind this is that in any food system, there are multiple different ways that a person could access food. And so you could have farmers markets and independent grocers and supermarkets. And so if there's a crisis that makes it impossible for a farmer's market to open, you still have other sources and people can go to other sources of food. And those sources are all accessible to everyone. Another thing that can support resilience is connectivity. So being able to really quickly communicate with other people in the system and basically be able to respond to something more quickly. And so we've seen, our global food supply chain is very connected, but also one of the roles that we've seen come out of local governments during the pandemic is kind of being a connector and connecting different community organizations to try and coordinate and more quickly respond to food security needs during the pandemic. So that can help to build that resilience in the short term. Providing or having capital reserves like social capital, financial backups, political support for these different kind of efforts to build resilience can also be important. And a lot of that we may see or try to encourage at a community level by seeing what are the ways that people are helping each other out in a crisis at a very local level, and how are neighbors helping one another out. And that's kind of the social capital aspect of this. We've also seen some flexibility during the COVID with the governments allowing waivers for school meal programs so that schools can still distribute food at rec centers and elsewhere despite schools being closed. And then preparedness is important, but it's not the only thing. Just being prepared for something is not enough to be resilient to it. Going back to, again, the concept earlier of resilience as being able to withstand and overcome something, even if you're not prepared for it. Next slide, please. All right. So that's the quick overview of how we're thinking about food system resilience. And so I'll pass it over to Meg, but I really encourage you to think about what's missing from these different approaches, or what are they, throughout this workshop, just think about how they mesh together, maybe how they don't, and what this all means in your work. So I'll pass it back to Meg now.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And I see the questions about the slides in the chat box. We yes, you can have access to the slides. One of the team members will respond to that. I'm going to get us started with breakout rooms just so that we do not run late, because I want to make sure that we get full time for breaks and we end on time. So we are going to be putting you into groups that are going to be randomly assigned by Zoom. If for some reason you end up in a situation, you can always ask for help if there's a problem with the rooms, but you'll be in a room with probably about 4 people. You'll spend about 35 minutes, probably a few minutes less than that. So say around 30 minutes. And we're going to ask you to share out after the breakout. So be listening for those things that are really stick out in your mind that you'd like to share with the full group. So in a second, the host will invite you to join a room. You'll click join breakout room. And when the breakout rooms are over, you'll be prompted to return to the meeting. If you need help at any time during the group, remember that the chat box, when you're in a breakout room, only the little group that you're in can see it, not the full group. So you'll need to click the ask for help button and invite the host to the room, and they can help with the situation. We'll also be kind of popping in and out of rooms if there's a problem. Jenna, I want to turn it over to you to give some specific tech instructions on the Jamboard.
Yeah, sure. So each of the breakout groups, you're going to have your own individual Jamboard link. So if you are in breakout group 1, you will click the group 1 Jamboard link that we'll chat out momentarily. If you're in breakout group 10, go to the link 10, and what your Jamboard is going to look like for folks who are not familiar is this. So this is exactly what group 1 is going to be led to. And the first slide on the Jamboard is basically just instructions that you're going to have about half an hour to go through these questions, and that we would invite each participant in the breakout to contribute. If anyone is having issues contributing to the Jamboard, you could always invite one of your group members to be a scribe. But the first reflection question is really on what equity-centered disaster justice means for you and your work. What does it look like? How does it show up in your community? How does it show up in your work? So it's not just about food systems work, but absolutely inclusive of that. So to add to a Jamboard, it's basically a sticky note. So you can scroll over and click this little sticky note icon and then start typing. And then once you contribute the note to the Jamboard, it'll show up, and then you can just drag it and drop it wherever you would like it to go. And then we'll be chatting you through the breakout group chat instruction at around halfway point to move to the second reflection question, which is, what does food system resilience mean for you and your work with your community? How does it show up in your community? How does it show up in your food system work? How does or doesn't your food system resilience work incorporate this concept of autonomy? And then how did or didn't you see disaster justice or food systems resilience elements during your response to COVID-19 or another disaster? You don't have to respond to each individual question, but these are just prompts that you're invited to reflect on as you get to know the folks in your breakout group and really think about these nuanced and big concepts that we're hoping folks can apply in your smaller group discussions. And so Catherine included the group links to each of the groups. If for whatever reason you're having issues accessing your Jamboard, that's when you call for help. And one of us will come and make sure you have access. And so I think with that, we're ready to open up breakouts.
Started again. It looks like we've got most people back from rooms, but I'm sure there's some people that are still hopping over. But we'd really like to hear what you discussed in your group. So I'm sure it didn't seem like enough time for the discussion, but just to note that we'll be back in breakout rooms later on, and you'll be in the same group that you were just in, so you can build on that discussion that you just had. So we would love to hear what your group shared about. The question on the screen, which we can take down in a second, but we just wanted to have it up there so you could see it. But what key insights emerged from your discussion? So we'd love to hear if you would like to use the hand raising function. It's in the reaction section on your bottom right, the smiley face emoji. You can use the raise hand button and let us know that you'd like to speak. You can also comment in the chat box, but just a reminder that we're here to learn from each other and hear kind of what you were thinking in your group. So we would please, who would love to share? We always love the person, especially who would like to share first. So anyone want to share kind of what you discussed in your group? Oh, Lindsay, I'm sorry, go ahead. Would you like to go first, Lindsay Adams?
Okay, sorry, it wasn't letting me unmute, but here I am. Hi, everyone. So I would say there were a few things that came up. I would say some key insights or something that really was prevalent is just like ensuring the voices of those that are most greatly impacted by a disaster are heard. And so we talked about a number of different ways that could happen. We also talked about some of the complications like associated with that happening during an emergency when everyone's kind of moving quickly and trying to get things done. You know, how can we make sure to lift up the voices of those that are most impacted by this in a meaningful way. And so that came up through either like community participation. Someone from the group also talked about bringing in people that are representative of different cultures that can assist in training and working with them more on like a partnership level to ensure that, you know, steps moving forward remain like culturally appropriate and equitable. Another piece that came up was just kind of navigating specific barriers during a disaster. So we talked about language, like appropriate language and materials, appropriate trainings, things like federal benefits, and when individuals are nervous about things like deportation, like how to navigate that coming from some of these more siloed spaces, like if you're used to working in policy or used to working in nutrition education, how do you kind of navigate these more complex problems? I don't know how much time does that feel like a good summary, Meg, or do you want?
Yeah, I think that's great. Thank you so much, Lindsay. And
no problem.
Andrea, I'm going to go to you next. Andrea Clark, I see your hand raised. And I also just wanted to note that Elisa in the chat noted culturally appropriate food as well, which kind of goes with what Lindsay was saying. Oh no, you're missing. Andrea, are you still? I think your hand is not raised. Oh, perfect. Turning it over to you.
Sorry, I lowered it after you said my name. We barely scratched the surface. And we spent most of the time on slide 2. And we talked about how specifically in the state of Missouri, that you could see the areas that kind of had existing organizations and networks in place, kind of had a more resilient response to like the pandemic and supply chain disruptions and food insecurity. So having those established organizations and connections and capacity to apply for grants and things like that, that infrastructure laid ahead of time kind of supported the resilience of the food system in certain places and less so in others. And then one question that we really felt like we needed to sit with the idea of incorporating autonomy into food systems resilience. And maybe it's because we didn't get to spend a lot of time with the slide about it. But we also were thinking about, it's like community connections are super important, and connections to the government as well at all the different levels because of the policies that are being passed and the funding that becomes available to respond to disasters. And so thinking about autonomy versus community versus like our formal governmental systems, just thinking more about what that looks like. And I wondered if autonomy, instead of like an individual autonomy, if maybe thinking of like community determination or like food sovereignty was more what it was getting at, but just we were really intrigued by the idea, what autonomy and food system resilience looks like, and kind of a little bit more about what it means exactly. Those are kind of the two big things that we talked about.
Great. Are there others that would like to share? We probably have time for one more. Oh, good. Michael, I see you have your hand raised. Turning it over to you.
Oh, well, if there's just one left, then no, I had this observation just now, looking back at when we were talking about equity-centered justice, and somebody mentioned sort of the idea of the people who don't want to accept help, mainly because they don't feel like big government should be helping them, and which then got me thinking about food security and how food security's definition is all people at all times getting healthy food, and so how do you deal with those issues in the food system to reach people who may not be inclined to accepting help, and obviously they're making choices for maybe younger kids who will suffer from that. So just a thought.
Any other final thoughts? Oh, sure. Aubrey?
I think a lot of what came up in our discussion, and some of it because of, I know, like the work that I do, was recognizing that there are groups, that aren't represented and don't have the same access to resources. And especially, during the disaster, a lot of money was going to some of those traditional partners, and that left out quite a few groups that actually jumped in to do the work. And so, a big part of our role was trying to identify where are those groups that are doing the work within their community and getting them the resources, instead of trying to make them fit into the model, just recognizing the value that they're bringing to the system already and getting them what they need, and then working on fixing the system that's not serving them at the same time. That's, I think, a lot of people who fell into the margin, were in the margins before, just fell deeper, and it was the others in the margins that were helping, not some of these traditional systems that I think many have relied on.
Great points. Thank you so much for sharing that. So we are going to break for our first break. We've got about 15 minutes. We're going to have a timer, and then we'll share the slides again and have a timer so that you'll be able to pop in and see how long we've got. I do want to note that the slides have been emailed out as a PDF. So those of you who are requesting those, that should be in your inbox. You can put it in the chat if it's not. So we will see you in 15 minutes. That's going to be 12:45 Central Time, 1:45 Eastern Time. We'll see you in 15 minutes. Thank you so much. All right, I am going to keep going because I know that it's helpful if we stay on track. So sorry if it feels a little bit rushed, but we want to make sure that we stay on track and get to everything that we want to cover today. So let's see. Thank you for going to the next slide. So this is good. We are going to discuss two different processes and tools that could be used to support your work in building more resilient and equitable food systems. So the first process focuses on community-centered continuity of operations plans, and the second is from the local government perspective and outlines a process for food system resilience planning. So while there are many shared end goals between these two processes, the methods and ways of achieving them are a little bit different. So we're going to be sharing both of these to help you assess if one aligns more with your work and vision. Both require collaboration, and they emphasize this workshop's theme of equity and justice-centered work. So I'm going to hand it back over to Jenna from the Praxis project to talk about their process first.
Thank you, Meg. Great. So on the screen, I wanted to just share this quote We want to be able to do tomorrow what we were doing yesterday, no matter what happens today. And so this is a quote that really underlies this concept of continuity of operations plans, which is a tool that we referenced throughout our learning circle. And really the purpose is to be able to follow through with this quote. Before I kind of dive into it, I want to first acknowledge and appreciate Living Hope Wheelchair Association. They have a disaster justice leader there named Tomas Aguilar, who taught me everything I know about continuity of operations plans and really shared his own wisdom and experience with our collective learning circle. And I also want to acknowledge that this concept of continuity of operations really varies depending on who we're talking about in the greater context. And I see this as being directly related to this discussion of resilience and this expectation of communities that have experienced the greatest amount of burden to have to kind of continue to be resilient in the face of disaster. And so really just want to acknowledge that we all hold different forms of work. Some organizations absolutely need to continue to operate in order for their communities to survive. And I think that many of us maybe identify in such a way. And also in face of disaster, for others, it might be the most beneficial to pause, to support staff and each other and oneself. And so really just kind of holding in mind this complex concept of continuity isn't really going to be the same for everybody. Next slide. And so continuity of operations plans, or what we call COOPs, they traditionally come from the government sector. So folks might be familiar or have heard of this, but essentially it's around continuing essential functions in the face of disaster, such as hospitals being able to continue to see patients in the response of a hurricane or an earthquake or a pandemic. And I think that so many of us have seen that play out and seen actual failures of many institutions failing to continue to operate, especially when we're thinking about the delivery of electricity in different communities. That's an example of an entity that would very much need to have a continuity of operations plan. However, we want to also acknowledge it's not the same thing as an emergency response plan. It is an effort by individual departments or agencies to sustain and resume essential functions and services during and directly after a disruption of normal activities. So it's not necessarily about immediately in response to a disaster, but in the wake of a disaster, how can some of those key essential functions continue to take place so that communities are getting their basic needs met? Next slide. And so again, part of what distinguishes this from an emergency response plan is that it's generally a longer term plan for when operations are interrupted for a longer period of time. And it's meant to reduce interruptions to those key essential functions or daily activities. It ought to be written in a way that everybody can understand and it's accessible, not be hundreds and hundreds of pages long, be translated into languages so that folks of different language preferences can utilize it, and also be kind of familiar to all staff involved within an organization or an agency or a team. To enable all individuals to continue to perform their functions after a disaster maybe strikes. And again, when I'm talking about disaster, really thinking through this holistic definition of disaster, which also kind of differentiates it from the traditional use of a COOP, which is very much focused on natural disasters. Next slide. So essentially what is included in a COOP is around thinking through the key components of your organizational functions. So what exactly does your organization do on a day-to-day basis and on a long-term basis? Who does those functions? Who's responsible for those functions? And what is the potential backup plan in the case of a disaster? And so this includes a huge range of activities from administrative functions So who checks the mail? And I think this probably came up for a lot of people, even in COVID-19, moving to remote work. How do folks continue to check the mail, receive checks, see if payments are being made on an administrative level if people are no longer working in an office? Also thinking about on a programmatic level, what services need to continue to be offered, and how would you continue to do so potentially without a physical space, or without being present physically? What are the ways of kind of working around that? Technological needs. So again, this feels very, very concrete in terms of people having to transition to Zoom in light of COVID-19. How does staff access passwords if the current systems that are in place are no longer accessible? And then communications needs. What will you do if there's no internet available and people aren't able to communicate with each other, but there's certain things that need to continue to happen? These are just some of the examples that we've asked ourselves in developing our own continuity of operations plans. The continuity of operations plan that we developed throughout the 6 months of our learning circle of many, many hours together over Zoom was different than a traditional COOP, because unlike a traditional COOP, which you could easily Google and see examples from FEMA or from other government entities, is that it also thinks about the personal level, the familial level, and the community level. So not just about an organization as, you know, where people show up and do work and perform services, but recognizing that everyone who shows up also has probably a family, is being personally impacted by a disaster, is a part of a community that is experiencing this disaster, and thinking about these disasters in a really holistic way. And so really just kind of holding that bigger picture context in what responding to and mitigating disaster might look like. And so this comprehensive COOP can also include aspects of a personal emergency plan. And so thinking about what's your family and household communication plan? How will you ensure that your family has access to food and medicine in face of a disaster? What's the evacuation plan? And really kind of keeping all of that in mind. Next slide. So again, I think we've come back to this multiple times, but this process of the learning circle and all of these concepts are really grounded in centering community experiences and thinking about community interconnectedness in terms of experiencing disaster, embarking on disaster justice, and really thinking about strengths. And so this really involves thinking about partnerships when developing a continuity of operations plans. We do not experience disasters in silos, and so we shouldn't have to navigate them alone either. The strength of continuity and impact can absolutely be enhanced through collaboration with other organizations, through existing disaster response and aid programs, through advocacy with government agency and officials. I see this being as directly related to this idea of challenging administrative barriers as like a part of autonomy, and thinking through what's our role as potentially food policy councils or nonprofit organizations that might have the ear of government agencies and really advocating for more accessible disaster response aid. Community COOPs also include non-traditional forms of services like mutual aid. And I think we've seen this in so many really powerful examples just in the last year, online in our own communities in response to even the natural disasters that many of us have faced in the last few months. And an example that I want to provide that was given to me from Living Hope Wheelchair Association that I was referencing earlier is around food banks providing food in Houston during Hurricane Harvey. And again, just reminding you that the community that Living Hope Wheelchair Association serves as primarily individuals with spinal cord injuries who are in wheelchairs, hence the name Living Hope Wheelchair Association. And these specific food banks that were cropping up were around drive-throughs. So only accessible via car, where individuals would drive through, would come pick up their food, in the wake of folks recovering from Hurricane Harvey. And so for individuals with disabilities or folks who are undocumented and didn't have access to driver's licenses, this completely excluded an entire group of the population that was being significantly impacted by disaster. And so this really shines a light on the importance of mutual aid. So there was, this incredible emergence of community support where neighbors were providing food delivery and drop-offs and really operating outside of an official organizational model. But I think that making space for this mutual aid response in a continuity of operations plan is really, really important for thinking through those community assets and strengths in different ways that community can show up for each other outside of being a part of an organization. Next slide. Okay, and so this is a sample of a COOP template. My disclaimer is that we don't have our adapted COOP ready to go because we spent months on it together, adapting it for the needs of this specific group that we were a part of. But we do have insights and lessons learned, and I think some really valuable takeaways that might be applicable to folks in the group today. But I did want to share the traditional path of what a continuity of operations plan looks like for folks who might be interested in developing one for your own agency, for your own community, and really think through how you can include that family, personal, social aspect. And so some of the key aspects of a continuity of operations plan is really being clear on what are the essential functions that need to continue to happen in the face of a disaster, if that is something that your team determines is the case. It also involves outlining roles and having clarity as to those roles, and potentially, quote unquote, chain of command, having democratic decision-making and non-hierarchical models I am a fan of is really valuable. And also having decision-making trees can be really valuable in the face of a disaster to streamline communication and to ensure that there is a shared understanding of what the response is going to look like. It includes really thinking through documentation and databases and how all of these can be accessible to people who need to continue to use it. So for our own organization, in response to COVID, we really had a more robust development of utilizing Box and ensuring that all forms of materials and documents are accessible in a really secure place. And then communications. And again, I think we're so incredibly reliant on the internet, which is so valuable. And what does it look like if that's not available to us in the face of a disaster? How can individuals communicate with each other? And so with our continuity of operations plan, which is in the spreadsheet format, and again, tailored to each individual organization that participated in the learning circle, we included all of these components, but we also asked these questions for the personal level, for the family level, for the community level. Again, recognizing that disasters don't just impact an organization, but everyone who is a part of the community that they're serving. Continuity of operations plans are meant to be designed by a team collectively versus an individual who's kind of taking on disaster response as part of their work. And this is because, in order to be able to effectively navigate disaster, there needs to be a shared understanding, but also really just questioning this concept of continuity in the first place. And thinking about how can disasters actually be seen as an opportunity for transformation. And so we started to actually reference our COOP as a TOOP, transformation of operations plan. One of the comments that came up in the chat earlier was really around thinking through what we've witnessed in the last year. This possibility for change, I think, has come because of disasters prompting windows of opportunity for transformation. And so it's kind of a big thing to wrap one's mind around, but I think it's an important conversation to have, that instead of automatically thinking through how do we continue doing everything we're doing exactly the same, maybe it's around how can we do things differently in the face of a disaster and see that as an opportunity. Next slide. So again, I'm sorry we're not leaving you with a handy dandy tool for you to apply, but we really wanted to leave you with these questions for you all to kind of chew on and think about the role of COOPs or TOOPs in your organization and in the work that you're doing, and what disaster justice and disaster response might look like for you. What makes it possible for communities to continue operating under disasters? What are those strengths that show up, and how are you able to really cultivate, invest in, resource those strengths? What existing partners in your network provide support when you see these disasters taking place? How do you recognize mutual aid operating in your community? And how do you see that as being a part of your own continuity of operations plan? And then lastly, how do you recognize opportunities for autonomy and transformation? And I see this as being directly connected to this transformative shift in food systems resilience as well. What are those windows of opportunity for thinking beyond service delivery, but really seeing the system itself change in the face of disaster? So very conceptual, but I really invite you all to kind of just sit with, reflect on these questions. If you have any comments or thoughts, please add them to the chat as we transition back to Meg to discuss the food systems resilience community of practice.
Thanks so much, Jenna. So we are going to shift and talk a little bit more about our community of practice, the Food System Resilience Community of Practice that was convened by Johns Hopkins University almost 2 years ago. So this project really focused on the local government perspective and the approach to food system resilience in cities. So local governments are distinctly equipped and responsible for doing this work, and local policies such as zoning laws, executive orders, transportation policies shape local food environments. So in the case of disruptive events, local governments can play a key role in this. To understand more about how local governments think about resilience, the Center for Livable Future, who's hosting today's session, and the Center for Applied Public Research, where I'm based, partnered with 5 cities, and some are here today. Thanks for those people who joined, to form a community of practice. And next slide, please. So the objectives of the group were to foster collaborative learning between a network of diverse cities working on food systems resilience, develop and test tools that enable stakeholders to understand and plan for resilience in the food system, and then to monitor and the process of the community of practice and evaluate the impacts for participants. So the group spent 6 months. We started in April of 2020 through October of 2020 on monthly calls, co-creating the components that would be combined to form the toolkit. The 6 months of calls were always intended to be virtual and conducted through Zoom. At the conclusion of the calls, we hosted a 2-part workshop that was in October of 2020, and that would have been in person if, obviously, like today's forum, we hadn't had to kind of shift gears because of COVID and go virtual with that. So I should note here that the recruitment for this group began in late 2019. And we moved forward in early 2020, April 2020 to be exact, given the city's interest in having a community of practice to participate in and share ideas with during the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the timing was especially important as the group provided a space for shared learning on the emergency food response to COVID-19. It was a trusted place to share what didn't work and the challenges that folks were facing, which were a lot during the beginning of the pandemic, especially because likely, for the first time, these were the challenges that people were facing because the COVID-19 pandemic was a new type of stressor to their city's food system. Next slide, please. So participants in the community of practice came from 5 cities across the United States. The cities included Baltimore, Maryland, Moorhead, Minnesota, Denver, Colorado, Orlando, Florida, and Austin, Texas. And prior to this community of practice, Baltimore had developed a food system resilience plan with CLF researchers, though it was refined based on the lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. But the other cities involved were at various stages of developing a plan. So in recruiting cities for this group, there was a main interest in including a diverse group of cities, geographically, socially, politically. For one example, Moorhead, Minnesota is on the border with Fargo, North Dakota, and takes a very regional approach to food system planning, which was a very important perspective to include. Additionally, I would note that the weather events that are affecting the cities in the group vary a lot, and that was an important context to this work. And right after, this group ended was the historic winter storm in Austin, Texas. So that was one thing that kind of continued in discussions as well. So next slide, please. So the process included the 6 monthly calls and then a 2-part workshop at the conclusion of those calls. The calls included, you can see kind of the trajectory on your screen. We started with an introductory call, obviously. Then we had a call that focused on stakeholders, followed by scoping and baseline assessment, hazard and vulnerability assessment, strategies for building food system resilience, and then the final call was about goal setting and implementation. During the workshop that followed the series of calls, we covered ways to track food system resilience and shared successes and challenges that were faced by each city and their experience during the pandemic. The second half of the workshop really focused on funding opportunities and communicating about food system resilience in their future work. So since the conclusion of the workshop in October 2020, we've continued to meet with monthly or every other month kind of informal calls to continue the conversation and shared learning. So I want to, thank you. I want to quickly mention some of the recurring themes that became apparent during the community of practice convenings. You can see them on your screen, but relationships are key, and we collaborate at the speed of trust. That was a great way that someone in the group faced that sentiment. Additionally, community collaboration, guidance, and input are vital, and co-creating solutions with equity at the center is critical. Language matters, and word choices are very important considerations. Definitions differ between sectors, so be careful how you define concepts in your work. Scoping is difficult, especially within the food system, which is big and complicated. Goals are good and they should be quantifiable, measurable, and obtainable. This work is essential, and often the harder and more complex systems work gets pushed off, but it's necessary. And then the process is iterative and nonlinear. So I am going to pass it on to Elsie to share a little bit more about the specifics of the toolkit and how it was co-created with this group.
Great, thanks so much, Meg. So as Meg mentioned, both during and between the monthly calls, we worked with the 5 cities to co-develop a suite of resources that can be used by others that are interested in planning for and working on food system resilience. The primary audience of this resource, which is being packaged as a toolkit, is local governments, but the tools are designed in a way that they can be adapted and used by other organizations that are interested in this work. So it provides a process for food system resilience planning. The toolkit itself is structured as independent modules, which I show on the screen, and that's so that they can be consumed at one's own pace, and they can be consumed either sequentially or individually. Throughout the community of practice, one of the things that emerged is that much work is already being done that supports food system resilience. And even if it might not be called that or be framed in that way, that it might be useful to jump around and use different parts of the toolkit depending on work that's already been done by a local government or an organization. Information on equity and justice-centered food system resilience work has its own module, but it's also embedded throughout the toolkit based on its importance. This toolkit is still in its final development stages, but we're definitely happy to share it with the group once the final product is available. Next slide, please. So based on the community of practice and previous work and research on food system resilience, we think at a high level, there's kind of these 4 key questions that can be useful in guiding food system resilience planning. And Erin shared these a little bit earlier on in today's session, but I want to revisit them. So the first is resilience of what? And that really considers what thing or system are you looking to make more resilient? The next question is resilience to what? So this is thinking about the potential disruptions that may impact a food system. And here it's important to think back to the earlier part of our session on concepts and framing. And remember that disasters can be natural or human-made, and really that holistic definition of disasters. The next question is resilience for what purpose? And this is thinking about what are the goals in building a more resilient food system? This may be short-term and focused on response efforts, or it could be longer term and focused on transforming an unjust and unequitable system and reducing the need to actually be resilient. The last question is resilience for whom? And this is a consideration of who's benefiting from the resilience work and what might be some of the potential unintended consequences. And this requires thinking about who's involved in food system resilience planning, who benefits and who's harmed. And to our earlier discussion, and has been mentioned in the chat, how can you work autonomy and sovereignty and transformation into this? So these 4 questions also provide a framework to understand what's included as a part of the toolkit. On the next few slides, I'm going to explore each of these questions in a little bit more detail and look at some of the resources that are included in a part of the toolkit. I want to note that we're not covering everything that's included in this toolkit, but highlighting a few things that we thought would be of interest to the group today. Next slide, please. So going to that question around resilience of what? If you're thinking about doing this work based on the communication and collaboration with the community of practice, it came out that it's important to start with a shared understanding of what system it is that you're trying to make more resilient. Even within the food system, what are the boundaries of that work? So I show here a picture of San Diego with 2 possible ways that one might draw a boundary of the food system. This is not the actual boundaries for the San Diego food system. And if someone today is from San Diego and working in the food system, would be curious to know how you actually are defining the boundaries. But this is used to illustrate that different people and organizations and even government agencies might have a different conceptualization of what system you're talking about. So we suggest that it's helpful to consider the boundaries both from a geographic and space perspective and a time perspective. So what is the time frame that you're working on? Within this toolkit, there's several resources to help you do this. And they're mostly in the getting started section of the toolkit. The first is more details about this time and space elements of the food system and what these really mean and how you can consider them. The second is tools to help you define the food system boundaries and within defining the system, what assets are already included. And last but certainly not least, who are the key actors that are engaged in this system that you would want to have be a part of a food system resilience planning process? Next slide, please. So to the second question around resilience to what? And this is around considering possible disruptions to the food system. Again, these could be natural or man-made, and they can be in the form of a shock, a short-term disturbance like a hurricane, or a stressor, which is oftentimes more long-term and residual, things like political instability or chronic food insecurity. In this toolkit, there's resources to help you identify food as critical infrastructure in a scoping and baseline assessment, to identify relevant hazards and to estimate the likelihood and the impact of these hazards in a system, and then to identify physical, natural, and social vulnerabilities in the food system in a vulnerability assessment. I show here a section of one of the tools, which is the Food Systems Risk Assessment Matrix, which can be used to assess the likelihood, impact, and risk of potential disruptions to the food system. The numbers shown here are just hypothetical. Next slide, please. So once you've identified the system that you're interested in making more resilient and what you're trying to make it resilient to, the next part is a consideration of for what purpose are you making it resilient? Or to put simply, what are the goals of this work and what action will support these goals? In the toolkit, we provide many resources to help you identify these goals. On the side of the screen, I show an example of previous work that was done on food system resilience as a collaboration between the Baltimore Office of Sustainability and the Center for a Livable Future. Through their processes, they identified strategies that would improve food access, which is in dark red at the top, food availability in orange in the middle section, and food acceptability in yellow at the bottom. This is not a complete list of all of the strategies that were identified as a part of this process, but it highlights a few different actions that may support food system resilience by reducing vulnerabilities. So once your planning team has identified strategies, it's also important to consider implementing them and evaluating their implementation and maintaining and sustaining this work. The toolkit provides a variety of different resources and tips to help with this. It's important to note here that much food system resilience work done by local governments is still fairly new. So as a part of this toolkit, this also draws on other work that's been implemented that may be related to food system resilience or support it. This is also a space for a lot of continued shared learning. So we're keen to hear about what have been the challenges and the successes about implementing food system resilience related work that you all might have done. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, equity and justice are central to this toolkit, and this was really one of the resounding commonalities during the community of practice conversations. It's the importance of centering this work around equity and around justice. So resilience should be done in a way, in the toolkit explains that it promotes procedural, distributional, structural, and intergenerational equity. We outline these approaches and what it might look like in food system resilience planning, why it's important, and potential ways to center food system resilience work around equity and justice. The focus in the toolkit is specifically around food system resilience and operationalizing equity in this planning. There's numerous other resources that we point to as a part of it that look at inequalities and racism in the food system more generally. And I just want to end with noting that it's critical that this work and as a part of this toolkit is collaboration. As Jenna mentioned in their COOP learning process, the importance of working with partners and getting the correct team together for this work is really central. So we're now going to move to thinking about a little bit more these two processes and the tools and how they may or may not be useful to your work. So I'm going to hand it over to Erin.
Thanks, Elsie, for that presentation. And as Elsie mentioned, the toolkit hasn't been published yet. We have a draft of it and we're trying to finish it soon. But if you're interested in seeing that final product and using it, we will be sharing that more broadly soon. So we presented two different types of ways that a community or a local government or some combination of that could approach this topic of food system resilience in kind of a more actionable way. So we just like to open it up to the larger group here for some discussion and reflection on these two approaches with a couple of questions. So you could either respond in the chat or raise your hand and speak. But let us know, what are some key themes that you might take away from these different approaches? What things kind of jumped out to you as you were hearing both of the presentations? Let's see. Thank you, Jenna. Jenna just posted the questions in the chat so we can stop screen share while we discuss. Thanks. All right, somebody has a hand. Nell, go ahead.
Yeah, I think throughout it's kind of making it a point to investigate the motivations or the incentives behind these actions and these developments. So why are we doing this? Who is benefiting? All those things that I think are really important.
thank you. Thanks for that. Any other thoughts on key themes or kind of things that jumped out at you? Aubrey, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
I would say one of the key things that stood out was really just calling out that relationships are key, but that the collaboration at the speed of trust, just because you put a bunch of people together doesn't mean that there's trust there to actually move any of the work forward. So just calling that out, I thought was really important.
Great, thanks. And Andrea said, I can see both of these approaches being used together in a local or regional planning process. All right. And so the second question that we had for you was, if you were to use one of these approaches, what else would you need to know to kind of get started doing something like this? Or what else would you need to consider? We've just gave a very high level kind of review of these different approaches, but what else would you need to know to do this? Roger, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think one thing I was just sitting with from the start of the presentation, drawing the boundary around San Diego, that the one really challenging thing, or one of the many challenging things, is that boundary is way too small when we're talking about interruptions in the food system, particularly being in Chicago and having fantasies of self-sufficient Southern California feeding itself. But that, considering the width and breadth of the interruptions last year, and especially climate interruptions, that the supply just not getting into our region is a big issue, depending on the level of crisis. And so our boundary has to be well beyond, that relatively small geography of a metropolitan region. So it's almost impossible to segregate the two depending on the scale of the crisis. And so being able to have to think beyond the boundaries of our own space, our own, thinking much more of like an upper Midwest rather than a city level geography. And then even like some of the responses that came back from the food box, the USDA food box, we were trying to collaborate and come up with more localized solutions, but the USDA was their crisis response and all that money that was flowing through, at some point it shifted from local distributors to distributors out of state who were bringing in the product, and we had no control or input in that process as well. Mm-hmm. So really, I think being able to be multi-level and think about all the different influences, especially when it's a lot of the money that's going to be influencing this work is going to be coming from the federal government, and how those programs are designed and implemented has a big perspective on this as well.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. It looks like Donna agrees with you. And that's definitely something that we've heard from the cities that we've been working with, and that the food system is, it can be global in scale. And it's sometimes helps to think about, whoever is working on this, like what do you have the power to change, and kind of what are the boundaries of where you can have some impact, and in some cases it might be working at a very local level, or it might be kind of changing levers at a regional or national or global scale. So thank you so much for bringing that up. And there was another question. Here we go. Oh, so Laura brought something up. She said, I'm interested in knowing how cities and organizations compensate people for their time when they co-create solutions with those most impacted by inequities in the food system. And that's a really great question. And, I'd kind of like to know, has anybody done that type of thing? And how did you compensate people for working together on this. It doesn't not, oh, okay. Miley, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name.
Yes, hello, Miley Otterson, Springfield.
Miley.
Yeah, hi everybody. We have 18 community gardens and 4 farm incubators. I am a paid director after 7 years of volunteering, and most of our funding comes from private foundations, but also from the USDA. They have amazing programs, and I'd like to reiterate what was said earlier. You have to use federal funding along with grassroots community efforts and private money to do this work. And I'm paid a fair wage, a living wage, according to the MIT calculator for living wage. And also we have 14 staff that are paid to teach regenerative agriculture and do administrative work that is mostly paid with private funding and the USDA funding. So I hope that that was on point to the question.
Thanks for sharing that, Miley. All right, so we have about 15 minutes before another break. And so we would like to offer the opportunity for you to talk in small groups again and kind of unpack some of these approaches and issues together. So I'm gonna ask Rachel to help you all return to your groups, and we'll come back in about 15 minutes.
The next part of the day is going to really focus on action planning. So we're going to revisit breakout rooms one final time, and then we'll have a share out probably by group at the end of that session. And so I just want to note that if you need to be reassigned to a new breakout room for any reason, come back to the main session and we can go ahead and get you put back into a new room. So during these breakout rooms, you can see the prompts. I actually was flipping through, and I know that a few of you actually started working on this Jamboard during the last breakout room. The topic kind of ties together. We're going to definitely focus on those Jamboards now, but if you've already started that conversation, that's great. And please try to have one person that is making sure that everyone is sharing. We want to make sure that every voice is heard and everyone has a chance to participate and share. If it's easier for folks to use Jamboard by having one person be the scribe or kind of keep track of notes, that's fine. And then please make sure that you're keeping track of time as well. So what we suggest spending about 15 minutes on each question. We're going to have about 30 minutes total in the breakout rooms. And then let's see, Jenna, I want to turn it over to you and see if you have anything to add before we get started.
Awesome. Thanks, Meg. Yeah, so just a few notes. You're going to be in the same Jamboard as before. So if you moved groups, that's totally fine. You're going to be in a new Jamboard. Just make sure that your Jamboard link corresponds to the breakout group number. And if you scroll to slide 4, that's going to kind of embark on the new set of questions. And so the first one is really around what are the strengths that you recognize in your own community, your own organization, your own network for advancing food systems resilience. Chances are you probably touched on that in previous breakouts. So we really want to just put it down in writing, focusing on those strengths and assets. And then the next part is really around opportunities. Have you identified any opportunities as next steps from today's concepts that we've shared, tools that we've touched on, discussions that we've had, whether it's bringing the conversation back to your team, following up with any of the attendees here or the facilitators? What's next for you to ensure that these ideas actually move us towards action, and really emphasize the importance of each person sharing in the conversation so that all voices are heard. And please prepare to have a very quick share back at the end.
All right, there we go. It looks like everyone is back from the breakout room. So it's great to see you all here again. We wanted to take a few minutes. We are almost finished for the day, but we've heard a lot of requests to hear some sharing from what other groups are talking about and kind of the big picture things that are happening in other groups. So I'm going to call on the groups actually one by one. So think about some of those. This is a spoiler alert, so I'll be prepared. Make sure that you have a couple of things to share. We'd love to hear what was happening in those groups. So you can also add things in the chat box, maybe if a group member is speaking and you want to add something on. I will remind you that we want you to speak from your own experience, so try not to speak for another member in your group. You can always prompt them if there's something that they said that really resonated with you. You could ask them to share, but be careful about some of those boundaries. But we'd love to hear some of just the key insights that emerged in your discussion throughout this last breakout room. Let's see, can I go to group one? I'm going to be boring and go in order. I know that there was a great discussion happening in group one. So if someone from group one would like to volunteer to speak, that would be great.
This is Bahia. If I was trying to stare intently at Lindsay, who had volunteered and was taking notes, but I graciously admit she did more for us already. I would say one of the big takeaways that I had from this breakout discussion was, again, so we had people from all over the nation, and for me, it is reassuring to hear that there are these victories that are happening, there's collaboration, and that there is this growth in this space where we're elevating needs and working towards addressing them, especially in emergent situations. And also that we have so many of the shared barriers and roadblocks, and that it's not that we are continually finding new and creative ways to make this work harder, but that oftentimes we have the same barriers to get over. And I loved the resources that were shared talking about COADs and emergency planning committees and all of these different ways that communities are forming partnerships that cross boundaries between economic development and human services and public and private institutions and agencies, and bringing these things together.
Thank you so much. Before we move on to group two, I just want to pause for a second to see if there's anything that anyone else from group one wanted to add. Okay, group two. Also, if you can't remember your group number, it's on the Jamboard.
I can share some of what we have in our notes.
Okay, great.
So in terms of strengths, we talked about having social services that are integrated into local emergency response as being a strength in one of the communities. We talked about having the political and community will to work together as another strength. We talked about existing resources and expertise, and also the importance of having diverse types of expertise in our communities. And also the importance of making sure that we were collecting and gathering and listening to diverse types of expertise. Resources, connections, and also strong community-based organizations that are ready to continue working together, implementing solutions. So this was kind of a summary of what we have in our notes as strengths. And then in terms of opportunities, again, continue to build that political will, and related to that, find opportunities to support or participate in advocacy efforts. We touched on the importance of building a sense of community and continue to strengthen that sense of community to build political will, to support advocacy efforts, and to work at those more systemic, structural, and policy levels that are needed. We talked about the role of schools and how the important role that the schools played during COVID, how those can be leveraged and strengthened as part of resiliency planning and resiliency efforts. And we had an interesting conversation about the difference between rural and urban solutions and rural or urban resiliency plans, and all the implications in terms of infrastructure and resources available to do that. So I don't know if anybody from the group would like to build on that or add. That's kind of a summary of our discussion.
Okay, if there are no takers to add on to that, group 3.
I'll go ahead for group 3.
Okay.
We talked a little bit about how collaboration with different partners and how that could impact how we serve people who are in need, especially for food insecurity. We talked about looking at access to land for more community farms through whether for more urban agriculture projects, so either through private donation or government access to some land. We talked about looking at federal opportunities for federal funding because sometimes we have the ideas, but we just don't have the funding, so the ideas never get off the ground because we don't know where to look for funding. And so looking at different federal opportunities for funding in places that we probably wouldn't have thought of initially would be another good way to get funding for some of the projects that we have that could impact people who are food insecure. Also partner with maybe universities and clubs and different organizations to bring students in, not only to help them learn about food insecurity, but have them work as part of the process. So they're learning the food systems, but they're also contributing as well.
Great, thank you. Anything else to add from group 3? All right, I don't think we had a 4 or 5, so 6. Group 6, you are up.
I can go for group 6. We had a good chat. I think echoing a lot of the things that people have brought up already. Another thing that we talked about was how to really take all of the experiences that people had and make them into kind of like strategic planning moving forward. And, you know, as we've heard a lot today already, like local and regional food systems really provided a sense of crucial support during the COVID crisis due to this flexibility and partnerships and collaborations. And so one of the things that we talked about that we're working on moving forward is how do we communicate this value in a meaningful way to city and county and state policymakers and other funders to support these local and regional efforts long-term. Just really, like, there's a lot of funding and support available right now because these issues are so forward. But what happens when and if that like federal funding ends or is taken away, and are we facing a potential funding cliff when other crises come up or the focus gets shifted elsewhere?
Great, thank you so much. Let's move to group 7, strengths and opportunities with moving this work forward. Anything I guess I know we've had a lot of great things covered, so I'd love to hear anything that's new or different that came up in your group, but still happy to hear if you had some of the same thoughts as previous groups. So group 7.
So we talked a lot about the strengths in Nevada and California, in that we had a lot of regional and city and state task forces already in place before the pandemic, and that we were able to use those task forces to help throughout the pandemic to get things where they needed to go, and that the task force consists of people from, all parts of the food chain, so manufacturing, agriculture, nonprofits, food banks, local city, state government, so that the task force isn't just a group of nonprofits or a group of farmers, but it includes all of that. Unique to Nevada is also our casino population. They are a huge contributor to our food source here in both southern and northern Nevada, and so including them in that conversation because they feed so many through the restaurants and buffets. When everything shut down, they actually took all of the food that they had, knowing that they were shut down, and got it out to local nonprofits to get distributed to the community. So it can include businesses, restaurants, things like that as well. So from our group, we felt that within the state of Nevada and California, we had those task force in place before the pandemic, and that made a huge difference. And that was one of our strengths. The other thing that we talked about from on the opportunity side is that looking at our definition of disaster, I think the exercise that we did really at the beginning and asking each of us to what we define disaster as, and then looking at those different definitions is a good thing that we can do within our own staffs, as well as within those groups that we belong in, and having that kind of a conversation within those groups helps us to redefine what a disaster is, and what it may be for me, it won't be for somebody else. And that puts us kind of on that even playing field that while we may work in different industries, we can all look at that definition. And then moving forward is looking at some contingency plans and how the things that worked that we did, the things that didn't work, the things that we've had to change from doing business as usual, so that we can be successful, because right now we're in the eye of that tornado storm, and the second half of that storm's on its way, and we need to be prepared for that.
Thanks so much for sharing. Let's move to group number 8.
I can get started. We did not do the best of job capturing what we talked about. We had a really nice conversation. I know we started off by really talking about the importance of land access and ownership. And in Philadelphia, where I live, we are a couple months away from having the city's first ever comprehensive urban agriculture plan, which is really going to center making sure that people have access to land to grow on. And it was a pretty, I think, a good example of an equitable community engagement process. It was led by, in part, by a group of BIPOC urban growers, led the whole planning process. So I'm really excited about all the policies that are going to be coming out through that, which also have very specific roles for like what city government should do to implement the policies and what large nonprofits should do to implement the policies. I know someone else in our group talked about having a fund set up specifically for urban farmers, so to help them gain access to land and technical assistance and equipment and infrastructure to support local farms. And Aubrey, I see your face, so please add other things we talked about.
We talked about a lot of things. You did a great job.
All right, great. Thanks so much. I know the conversations are more important than filling in the Jamboard. So thank you so much. It's great to hear the conversations are so good. And no, group number 9.
I'm just going to shortly say that what really stood out to me in the wealth of conversation that we had was the importance of relationships, of building those relationships with people, ultimately the government and organizations and industry and everything else is made up of people and individuals. And so building those relationships and trust can help us move forward in all sorts of ways. And I saw that as an underlying theme in all the different comments that were made in our group.
Okay, great. Thank you. Group number 11.
I can go. So we talked a lot about the things that have already been touched on, but a lot of it was about connecting with groups within the community and maybe outside of people who you initially think are part of the food system. So working with businesses and schools and kind of knowing what resources they have available in the time that you do need to call upon them beforehand. And then it was really interesting just to hear what other people are doing in their communities. I know Chris talked about having a farmer's market that supports like SNAP and is more accessible to low-income groups, which was something that was really interesting to me. And then we talked about we talked about this in the first session, but compensating other entities and how do you do that to get them to participate with your programs. Not sure if anyone has anything else to add.
Thank you so much. That's great. Let's see, we've got 2 more groups and just a few more minutes before we wrap up. So group 12, any quick points to add?
I'll very quickly summarize. So as far as strengths, I talked about the cultural identity and the weight behind the collective weight behind that as a potential to create a really robust awareness of the food system and how it has a collective effect. And then another person talked about in North Dakota, they have a statewide local food system development network as a really good resource to move from. Another had a newly formed food policy council in their area. And then as far as opportunities that we identified, we talked a lot about, the bulk of the conversation was talking about how to encourage engagement. And so we all had a lot of different ideas and experiences with different ways of structuring meetings. So splitting up kind of more nitty-gritty administrative food policy council meetings with either like a focus meeting talking about farmers markets or having a guest speaker to kind of encourage people to attend just to learn out of curiosity. Anybody else have anything that I forgot?
All right, great. Thank you. And last but not least, group number 13.
I think our note taker had to leave because her computer was just about to shut down.
from an IT push out. So I will try my best to just do a very 30,000-foot recap. I think we talked about the strengths we talked about were really about kind of the different parts of the community, like really looking outside your box to bring in other parts of the food system when you're trying to address whatever you're trying to address in your resiliency planning. So that resiliency for what is, I think, is an important question to answer. And then, but you know, like you do have to kind of do that analysis of, well, what are the barriers? What's preventing X from happening? And then looking outside of the box as to what partners maybe you haven't considered. I think that's the whole notion of the, you know, it's hard to draw your boundaries in around what you're talking about, but maybe looking just in terms of who's not already included at the table and how they could be possible. So bring possible solutions to the planning effort or to what you're, you know, we talked a lot about like community gardens and school gardens and some of the challenges about, you know, about getting those started. Yes, but even more importantly, how can they be utilized to make a more robust, resilient food system, meeting some of the needs like of low-income families or immigrants or whatever group happens to be in the most need at the time. Kelly, I don't know if I hit on any of the important things.
I think Donna, you hit on most of them. I'll just add that land access piece I think is very important, especially in our city with the growth that we've seen here in Rochester, Minnesota being so significant and the way our development is going. So I think land access is a real key piece. And then with the high cultural and racial diversity that we have here in our community, speaking 16 different languages in the high schools, the racial justice piece is really becoming a huge issue here as well.
Great, thank you to all of the groups for sharing. That was extremely helpful so that we all hear some of the topics that were coming up in all of those groups. I want to quickly, Rachel, can you give a little bit of a heads up about what is to come with the rest of the forum? And after Rachel, I'm going to turn it over to Jenna and Erin to kind of close us down. And then, so Rachel, I'm going to turn to you first.
Thanks, Meg. And just want to give a plug that in 1 hour, I know we've been on Zoom for 4 hours already today, but the opening of the forum officially starts in 1 hour with a welcome and plenary session that is focused on the role of racially equitable policy in transforming food systems. If you're interested, the whole list of speakers, there will be 8, and it will be a really great session. So I highly encourage you to join if you can. This will be recorded. The plenary will, so you can access it later, but hope that you can join live and also to join the rest of the forum over the next 2 days. We're really excited and hope to continue these really robust conversations over the next few days. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And Rachel, can you share slides one more time and just put up that contact information slide for us? That would be great. Just a quick note that the slides have been emailed out to you. They're in a PDF, so they're in your inbox. And then another note that we've had a request for us to kind of go back and look at the resource list and add some of the links that were shared in the chat box. So we will do that and make sure that you get access to that. So Jenna, Erin, any final closing thoughts?
Yeah, just thank you all so much on behalf of the Praxis team. I want to ensure that folks see in the resource document that Erin sent out yesterday, we sent out a list of resources that kind of expand on the disaster justice learning circle, the tools we shared, community organizers kind of doing this work on the ground, and also some principles for authentic community partnership that might feel really relevant to you all, as well as this excellent guide from Heal Food Alliance on uplifting a BIPOC-led vision for crisis-proof food systems. And lastly, please don't hesitate to reach out. Here's my contact information on behalf of Catherine and myself, and just really appreciate this time together. And I'll pass it to Erin for closing.
Thanks, Jenna, and thank you everyone for joining today and for sticking with us until the end. I know this was intense. We threw a lot of information at you, but I hope that you got a lot out of it and that you have a lot to think about. And I hope that you can continue some of these conversations as you go through the rest of the forum, and that some of the ideas we've put forth here today will stick with you. As I mentioned earlier, and as Elsie shared with you all, we are planning on releasing a food system resilience planning toolkit in the this fall. Don't have a date yet, but we're working on it, and we really hope that it can be useful to a variety of different types of users, even pieces of it, because we recognize that there's a lot of work to be done still, and as we deal with the pandemic and eventually kind of come out of it and think about what does recovery mean, what does equity and justice in the food system mean, not just now, but also in a post-COVID world. We hope that those resources that we're coming out with can be helpful in thinking through that with you. If you have questions about the Center for Livable Future's work on this, we do have some links also in the resource document about some of the work that we've done with Baltimore City. And then my contact information is here as well if you'd like to reach out individually, whether you have questions or you're starting this type of work or you've done it and you want to share what you've done. We are always looking for more examples and stories of how people are approaching food system resilience in their work. So thank you all for coming. And I don't know, Meg, do you have any other final words?
No, but I'm going to put you on a spot for a second because someone, a couple people asked if we could send the toolkit out to this group when it's complete, and I think the answer is yes. So we will make a note to do that. We'd be happy to do that. So just want to say thank you to everyone who participated today. We're so thankful that you were here. It was great getting to know all of you and hearing about what's happening in your cities.